What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be covering part 2 of Holley Carb's Hidden Secrets. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly suggest that you go up here and click that little link and watch that video before you watch this one, so that it kind of makes sense and it kind of goes in order. I've had a lot of positive feedback from the last video, and today we're going to go over some more things that didn't have time to do. I could literally talk about this stuff for hours. So trying to condense it into a little YouTube video can be kind of tough, but I hope that you get the gist of it, and let's get started on this. In the last video, we talked about the booster's performance and how they affect the carburetor's functions in different applications. Today we're going to start off with the power valve. The power valve is a neat little thing. In fact, it's a one-way valve that allows fuel to come in from here and come out here when it reaches the appropriate vacuum value, which is normally stamped on the back side. And you can see this is a 6.5. Sometimes it's marked on the edge, and sometimes you don't see markings at all. So let's talk about this. The main metering circuit is meant for cruise applications. When you're just tooling down the road in your hot rod, that is what the main circuit is for, cruising down the road at a steady speed. But when you hit a hill and the vacuum in the engine drops, that's where the power valve comes in. It keeps the engine from going lean and possibly getting into a detonation issue and hurting your pistons and all of that good stuff. Now, one mistake that I see a lot of people do is eliminate the power valve altogether. Now, yes, I will grant you, there are certain situations where you can remove the power valve in racing applications only, especially with 4-speed, manual transmission applications that's leaving at a lot of RPMs, that really doesn't have any other need for additional fuel in the lower RPM range. It's going to get everything. And the misconception about power valves blowing out. Since 1992, they have been putting restrictors here in the base plate that will limit, it's got a little check ball in it that prevents power valves from blowing out, which goes a long way in it. You can see that's an older base plate. You can actually see the restrictor right here, and there's a little check ball in there that prevents the power valve from blowing out whenever there's a backfire. So how do you tune for this? How do you know what number value is right for your engine? Well, Holley has had 2 different rules of thumbs through the years. One, when you're sitting at idle in gear, however how much vacuum you're seeing at that idling speed, divide that by 2, and that's the number that you need here. And then I've seen some situations where people will say idling in gear, and whatever that value is, say you're idling in gear at 12 inches of vacuum, you need to have a 10 power valve in it, a number 10. They take 2 numbers off of that value and select the power valve from there. For me, what I do is a little bit different than anyone else, if you can imagine that. I know in Casper, what I would do is actually drive the vehicle around with a vacuum gauge hooked up in the engine compartment, so I could see what was happening with the vacuum going down the road. And when it come up on a hill or get into a situation where you need more throttle, then that's when you want the power valve to open up. Basically, the lower the number you put in your carburetor, the later delay that the power valve is going to have in opening up. The higher the number, the faster it's going to open up. So something to consider. You know, you don't want to wait until you're down to 2 inches of vacuum and then have the power valve open up, because, you know, you're getting in a really high load situation at that point. But the critical thing about tuning with these things are these 2 orifices behind the power valve. This is called your power valve channel restriction right here. When you jet your carburetor, and these are the main jets, by the way, something that everyone who works on a Holley knows what they are. A lot of people will go to the track and they will jet the carburetor for the highest mile per hour. And while that is good, and that's how I do it, and we'll talk more about that later, but when you leave the track and you put bigger jets in here, what you have effectively done is alter the fuel curve of the main circuit itself. So what I do is I take my baseline, whatever it was running good at, in a lean state, cruising around, I take and use that number as my baseline, and whatever I find works optimum at the track, say these are 64s, and let's say these work great on having a good air-fuel mixture cruising around town. You go to the racetrack and I see that I need to bump it up to a 66 or 67 jets to get the mile per hour optimized. So what I will do is I will find out the area difference between this jet right here and the 67, and then I will increase the size of the power valve channel restrictions right here to equate to the differences in area that I calculated into 2 different jet sizes. That way I'm not giving up my part throttle fuel economy around town and on the highway for the expense of just wide open throttle. That is why those 2 holes are there to begin with. That is for your wide open throttle tuning of giving additional fuel through the booster into the engine. Oh, hey, what's up? You might be wondering why I'm drinking a drink there. Well, I'm going to show you how drinking through a straw is kind of related to your Holley carburetor, any other carburetor for that matter. We're going to talk about air bleeds and what they do and their purpose. Most people don't talk about air bleeds on YouTube or the internet. You know, they just think it's just a smaller tuning device, which it is, but it's a necessary part of your Holley carburetor for it to work right. So take this for example. If you had a carburetor that didn't have correction bleeds in it at all, actually the carburetor would get progressively richer and richer and richer as the RPMs go up. What is happening by introducing air to the fuel before it leaves the carburetor, it helps emulsify the fuel, it atomizes the mixture inside the carburetor itself. So that's one purpose. But 2, by doing that, it limits the amount of fuel that's being drawn through the carburetor, so it helps control the fuel curve. Now going back to my straw example, how does it apply? Have you ever had a straw that had a hole in it or had a slit in the straw and you tried to suck your drink through that straw that had a hole in it? It's kind of tough, right? And that's exactly what the air bleed does for the carburetor. It helps control that so that it delivers the proper mixture over a given wide RPM range. So let's talk about it for a little bit. You'll notice every Holley carburetor has 4 air bleeds for the primary and 4 for the secondary, excluding dominators. Dominators are another subject in itself, but the inside bleeds or correction jets are located towards the inside. The idle air bleeds are out here on the outside edge. And the correlation goes between like this. The high-speed air bleed has a direct correlation to the booster that you're going to be using And when I had Jim at Allstate Carburetor come up with these annular boosters for my center squirters, I talked in great deal with him about the high-speed air bleed size that we should run. And don't quote me on it, but I think we decided to go with a 31 or a 33 on the high-speed bleed, because there is a correlation there. If you do change boosters, know that you're going to have to change, most likely than not, your high-speed air bleed. Your idle air bleed works in conjunction with the idle feed restriction. You can actually go in here and enlarge this to lean the mixture out, or make it smaller to richen it up. Same thing applies with the high speed. If you make the orifice size larger, it will lean it out, and if you make it smaller, it will richen it up. But the key point is, if you get to a point to where you're making changes in your bleed sizes, go in very small increments, because a couple of thousandths can make a huge difference in the curve of what the carburetor is capable of giving. Next up on the list, we're going to talk about these emulsion holes right here in the metering block. What do they do, and what is their purpose? Well, like the air bleed, it introduces air to the fuel mixture in this channel right here. And some metering blocks will have 2 holes, some will have 3, some have much as 5. And even some metering blocks I've seen from Holley have none. So, by putting these holes here, you're actually going to emulsify the fuel in this channel, and you can actually tailor a fuel curve. Say, like if you're running really rich at top end of the RPM range, you can go in and enlarge this bottom hole here, because this is actually would be like a scale of RPM. This first hole is going to be lower RPM range, and you can see here in the middle it's going to be fat because it's in the middle, and then at the top you can go in and lean it out or richen it up based off of what your needs are. So we've talked a lot about the circuits in the carburetor, and now we're going to move on to the ultimate debate of all time regarding Holley carburetors: vacuum secondaries versus mechanical secondaries. And to me, this is about using the right carburetor on the right application, hands down. Can you make a vacuum secondary a double pumper? Yes and no. You can actually take and make the base plate mechanical where the secondaries open up, but without an accelerator pump, it's not going to work. You can machine the main body to put a squirter on the back side of the secondaries, but it's a lot of work. And at that point, unless you just have a carburetor that you're wanting to do this to, you're better off finding a double pumper and modifying that to begin with. So what are the advantages of a vacuum secondary over a double pumper? To me, if you have a fairly heavy car, when I'm talking fairly heavy, I'm talking like 3,500 pounds and up, and a fairly tight torque converter and not a lot of rear gear in the rear end, the vacuum secondary will most likely be faster. And that's because the acceleration rate of the car versus the engine RPM that you're dealing with. If you expose the secondaries open too quickly, you're going to get into a bog situation, meaning if you put a double pumper on it, the double pumper is a mechanical secondaries, and it's going to open them up when you mat it to the floor, and the engine simply cannot handle that because the car is not accelerating fast enough to overcome that. So where's that gray line in the sand of when you need to switch from a vacuum secondary to a double pumper? If you watch 318 Will Run channel, which is really good by the way, he built this drag truck and he just put a 360 Magnum down in it, and he had a 670 Street Avenger carburetor, and he went to a tried and tested double pumper, and he picked up 0.6 of a second at the 1/8 mile track. How does that happen? Well, first and foremost, he had a little bit looser converter. He had a lot of gear. And basically, the double pumper, all of the advantage is given right off of the starting line. Because having that second accelerator pump helps cover up that bog when you map the throttle and those secondaries open instantaneous. And that's what gives the added torque that you need. It hits the converter harder, and you will get a better 60-foot time. That is not uncommon results. I have seen that time and time again. Does that mean that you can't get a vacuum secondary to perform equally as well? No. You can do it, but it takes a ton of work and time and effort. I'm going to show you a video here of Casper when I had the 600 vacuum secondaries on the truck, and then we took it to the track, did a carb swap at the track and put the center squirters on it, and you can see just how close they were. Now ultimately the center squirters were faster, but the margin was pretty close to each other. And given that the truck was a little bit traction limited after that, well, you be the judge. You watch the film and see what you think. So what'd you think about the video of Casper with the 600s versus the 660s? Let's talk about that for just a second. One important note, the 600s were very finely tuned. I mean, those things were delivering a perfect air-fuel ratio for Casper. It was coming in at right around 12.9 to 13.0 at wide open throttle. Everything was on point. The 660s, that was straight off of the bench onto the truck type of deal. Even though it went faster with the 660s, those carbs were completely untuned. It was kind of like a shot in the dark as far as what I thought it would need for jetting and things of that sort. And it went faster with a 10-to-1 air-fuel ratio. So you can imagine what it was like afterwards. Another thing about the two different runs, on the first run with the 600s, it actually had a 160 60-foot time, which was decent for the truck. It had been in the 150s, but the temperature was kind of warm that day, kind of humid, so on and so forth. And the 60-foot times for the 660s were 162, 163 range. So once I got the 660s dialed in, got the air-fuel ratio where it needed to be, the truck was considerably faster with those carburetors. But there's more than just a vacuum secondary versus mechanical secondary going on here. That was also a change in boosters from the step down legs to the annulars. So, you know, it's not a true apple to apple comparison, but you can see the difference. So what did I do to those vacuum secondaries to get them to run like that? Let's take a look at what I did. So in front of me is the 600 vacuum secondary, and let's talk about the many changes that I did to get the vacuum secondary to work the way I wanted it to. First change I made was going from the 30cc accelerator pump to a 50cc accelerator pump. Combined that with a 28,000 squirter here, what that would do was increase the dwell time or the squirt time from the nozzle itself. So as the secondaries were opening up, the accelerator pump would still be squirting fuel even though the primaries were fully open. Another thing I did to kind of cheat the vacuum secondary in thinking that it was a double pumper, I went to the high-speed air bleeds and decreased the size there. You know, I told you a while ago that when you decrease that, it actually changed the timing of the fuel curve, meaning that if you make this smaller, it'll start flowing fuel sooner. Another thing that people don't realize is the fuel level in the bowl can be used as a tuning aid too, kind of a band-aid. I would raise the level in the fuel bowl as high as I could get it without it spilling over into the boosters. And what that would do is actually start the booster pulling fuel sooner than it normally would. Okay? And then last but not least is the diaphragm itself. I spent a ton of time changing springs, and I'll show you a spring chart right now of the different springs and what they do and the rate they open and all that good stuff. I experimented with taking the check ball out of this thing, putting the check ball back in it, to the point of even making my own little restrictors here so that I could control the rate in which the pot would actually pull the diaphragms open. One thing to note when you're dealing with vacuum secondaries is making sure that you have the proper length diaphragm, this rod right here, because they actually come in 3 different lengths if I'm not mistaken. I'll insert a picture of them, because if you get the wrong length rod, it will prevent the secondaries from fully opening. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. But those are the little tricks that I did to this, and like I said, it took a lot of time and effort to do it, but they worked really well. One last thing I'm going to talk about on the vacuum secondary thing is Quick Fuel actually sells a vacuum pot that achieves the same thing that I did with the little restrictor right here. And it actually has a screw that you can adjust in and out to control the rate of the diaphragm itself. Now you still have to find the spring that is right for your application, but once you have that, then you can fine tune even more with the screw itself. So I hope you get a better understanding of these vacuum secondary carbs and how they work and what I did to make it work on Casper. And the main thing about this is don't be afraid to experiment before you give up and go to something else, because I chased this rabbit all the way down the hole until I felt like I couldn't improve upon it anymore, and then that's when I made the move to the 660s. So once again, we've talked about a lot of different things today, and like I said, I could talk about this stuff for hours. I didn't get to cover the base plate modifications about going from a 2-corner to a 4-corner idle. So what I've decided to do is down the road we'll do a video on just that. We will do a video on changing boosters and using the all-state design with the threaded nut certs, and we will do separate videos along those lines. So I hope you got something out of this brief overview of the hidden secrets inside of a Holley carburetor and how you can make it work for you. The Holley engineers back in 1957 were really on point, because you can make this carburetor do anything that you need it to do. It just takes, once again, time and effort. I can't stress the importance of actually doing these changes and having a wideband O2 meter to meter your, or to gauge your process. You know, you don't know what you don't know. And by having that O2 meter, it opened my eyes up to what I was missing as far as drivability and fuel economy with a Holley carburetor. Now, that is not to say that it replaces plug reading, because it doesn't. You still have to rely on what the engine is telling you by the spark plugs. Just because you get an O2 reading in the exhaust pipe doesn't mean that every single cylinder is performing like it should. So that is why it should be used as a tuning aid in conjunction with plug reading. With all of that being said, I hope you guys and gals enjoyed this video, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button down there so that I can keep doing these videos. And until next time, this is Andy from Unity Motorsports Garage. I'll catch you later.